I'm Diane Dean. Welcome to the video version of my Photoshop Elements workshop for artists. This workshop is really designed for the artist who is interested in knowing more about Photoshop and Photoshop Elements to determine whether or not they might want to use Photoshop in their creative process. You'll see the image on the screen is a photograph that I took of a egret, which I did a painting from. One of the things that the participants of this workshop will understand is some of the ways that Photoshop can be used in the creative process. For example, this image was converted in Photoshop so that I could very clearly see the outline of the main objects in the image so that I could sketch my drawing prior to painting. This is one of the examples of the kinds of things you can do with Photoshop, and hopefully this workshop will give you enough of an understanding to make some decisions about whether or not you want to spend more time and invest in actually learning Photoshop Elements. And hopefully the way I approach presenting the information will eliminate some of the fear that many artists have of using technology in part of their creative process. So to begin with, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me. I have had a long relationship with Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. I actually worked for Adobe Systems for 15 years and worked with Photoshop before it was much of a product out in the world. I do use Photoshop in my day-to-day art activities, not only for my artwork, but I also do the advertising and publicity for a number of the local art organizations in my community. So I use Photoshop extensively in my creative process, and I continue to use it in a business sense as well. There's one topic that we really need to discuss at the very beginning of this workshop, and that's the difference between the Mac and the PC. Photoshop Elements will work in both environments. The interface, and when I talk about interface, I mean what you see on the screen and the way things work, will be a little bit different between the Mac and the PC. Photoshop works well in both environments. Just need to be aware of the differences. Most of the manuals are actually written for both and will notate where the differences are. Photoshop is also different from Photoshop Elements. There's a full-blown Photoshop product that's available as part of the Adobe Creative Suite, and it was initially the only form of Photoshop. Adobe introduced Photoshop Elements designed more for the non-printing, non-high-end advertising type of professional. And it was designed to be easier to use, although over the years it's added so many features that it's become more complicated and can really do quite a bit. It is much less expensive, and in fact you can get a trial version of Adobe Photoshop Elements. From the Adobe website you can download the actual product from www.adobe.com, and you have 30 days to use it. So what I recommend to students taking my workshop is that they download a trial version and even follow along with me when I get into the specifics in the demonstration and see if they can keep up with it, and then use the product for 30 days and decide whether or not it makes sense for them to actually invest in it. The current version for Photoshop Elements is version 9, and you can find earlier versions. In fact, version 6 forward really has everything that the artist needs. So you can find the earlier versions for a fraction of what the current version costs. So what can an artist do with Photoshop? This is a long list, and I'm not going to go through the whole list here. I'll actually present a little bit of information on each of these different functions, but it is a fairly extensive list, and you would find that these Photoshop techniques can really and truly make you more productive as an artist. I'll start though with a discussion of how do you get your images to work with in Photoshop Elements. I'm assuming that most people are familiar with or probably have a digital camera, and that will be the way that most people will be taking their inspiration photos, if they're landscapes or portraits, if they want to build some kind of a collaged image with a variety of images, they'll be using a digital camera. There is stock art that's available through various web services. Some of it is even free. If you do traditional photography and you've got printed photographs, you can of course scan them or have them scanned, but essentially you need the images in your computer to be able to work with Photoshop Elements. Regarding stock art, there are some issues for an artist, and one is to always be aware of the copyright issues. Some of the stock photography that's available today may give you the right to use one time a piece of art or a photograph, or for non-commercial purposes. So you just need to be aware, and if you're going to use any stock art, investigate what the responsibilities you have are in terms of protecting that copyright. And then also art for competitions, and in most situation should really be from your own concept and not from someone else's artwork. So that's something else to just keep in mind. So one of the most important things with capturing your images with your digital camera is to be sure you have your camera set for the very largest file setting. You want the largest number of dots per inch that your camera can take. And each camera will have a little bit different way in their menus of letting you identify whether you want more pictures that are smaller or fewer pictures that are larger. And you always want to do the larger setting because you'll have more information to work with when you get into Photoshop. And that will become a little more clear as we go through some of the topics. So the first and foremost area of Photoshop that will make all of the difference for you is understanding pixels. The way digital image editing works, and that's what Photoshop is. It is taking your digital image and allowing you to edit or modify that image. And of course it starts with getting the image in digitally, using your computer and the Photoshop software to make changes to the image. The basics of Photoshop are all centered around pixels. Pixels are essentially dots, and everyone has a little bit of experience with perhaps printing a photograph that wasn't very many dots per inch or wasn't a very high resolution, and as a result it looks all chunky, kind of like the image you see at the bottom right of the screen. That's actually a zoomed in or blown up portion of the image that you see up above. So what a pixel is really a dot that has a mathematical formula that tells Photoshop Elements where on the page or in your image that particular dot resides, what its color is, and what its color value is. So everyone who is involved in art understands value and how it relates to color. You go from 100% white to 100% black or dark of a particular color. So Photoshop is a set of mathematical calculations that analyze the scanned image and assign a location, a color, and a value to dots at a certain density. That's why when you are taking your photographs or scanning your photographs, you want to use the very highest resolution, because in order to do some fairly sophisticated things in Photoshop, you need a lot of dots per inch in order to make some of these changes work really well. When I actually get into demonstrating Photoshop Elements and running through some of these different examples, you'll get a much better feel for how pixels work, why understanding pixels is so important. Part 2 of my video demonstration of Photoshop Elements for Artists will actually take you through all of the screens and menus and palettes and tool options in Photoshop to get you started in performing some of the Photoshop functions that will support you as a creative artist. You can find Part 2 by going to my website, www.dianesdean.com.